I'm Zoe Colon, happy to be with you. Welcome to Bomba Live, found in translation, simulcast. Thank you to Bomba Live, Ray Collazo, and the crew.
Absolutely.
I'm co-host with Ray, and he offered us the opportunity to produce the Mujeres edition of Bomba Live, which I think is awesome, and I'm so excited about it. The
women taking over.
Right, and so if you didn't know, I'm Boricua, and we are Boricua from New York, right? New Yorkers, yes. And very involved in Latino advocacy and passionate about these issues. The Mujeres edition is an effort to lift voices like ours, right? Boricua female voices, and discuss our experiences in the diaspora. There's just so much to talk about. There's politics, family, being bicultural, Latinidad overall, the various, segments of our community and our experiences and how that impacts our ability to either come together on issues or not. And I'm just honored to share this space with fellow Boricuas, fellow New Yorkers, my mentors, las doctoras, Judy Perez, who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, and Dinorah Davis, I was going to call you, Dinorah Nieves, Dr. D. So thank you. And please, Dr. D, tell us a little bit about yourself and projects that you're working on before we get started.
I am so grateful to be on today and to have a good connection. I'm finally in Atlanta. We are starting to film for the next season of Yala Fix My Life on OWN, and it's really exciting. It's going to be awesome. And, on top of that, I'm also...
Explain what OWN is, okay? Because not everybody the acronym, not everybody...
Okay. Yeah, so OWN is the Oprah Winfrey Network.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Smart.
Yep. And so we'll be on there on Saturday night, so check your local listings. And this week I also started teaching at City College. I'm super excited. I love my students already. I'm teaching a course on racialization, which I'm excited to be teaching. So it's going to be a good few months. I'm excited. I'm exhausted, but I'm excited.
City College?
So CUNY City College is this.
Yes!
Yeah.
Where we met. All right. Represent. Yeah. I didn't realize you were teaching in New York again.
I am. Well, we're teaching remotely, but yeah, it's phenomenal. I love teaching that population of students because they're just like us, right? So a lot of young people of color who are first generation to the university level of study and are just really eager and ambitious and looking to learn, all of the things that we didn't know, right? Like there's so many things that I learned in college that would have shaped.
We don't talk about race.
Yeah.
We talk about race.
Had I really looked at it earlier. Exactly. Especially in the Latino community, which I know we're going to talk about. But, we're sort of stuck in this weird bubble where Latinos are a pan-ethnicity. And then we have all of these other ethnicities that sort of fall under that umbrella category. And I think that because of the way that was set up, for many Latinos, they don't believe race is applicable to us, right? We weren't taught.
We don't talk about those things.
We don't talk about race. And when we talk about race, it's frightening. When we talk about race and we finally sit to have those conversations and we look at the internalized racism and the history on the islands and in Latin America and, the impact of slavery and the diaspora.
I think there's just something very different about, teaching this subject to folks that look like you and I, right?
Oh,
and so, especially in New York, in the Bronx, in New York City, I did it as well. I worked at Lehman College for most of 8 years.
I remember.
And, when people, and this happened to me when I first took a class on race and ethnicity, when you're a product of a certain environment, this is part of your environment every day, and you're subject to certain beliefs and circumstances. So you don't really get to step outside of it to analyze it. You know what I'm saying? So I really love teaching, one, because of the population, two, because it got people to open up their eyes to all these injustices. Yeah. When I learned about the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony, I was like, what? Wait, I don't understand. Like, we're supposed to live in this post-colonial, society, right? So it didn't make any sense to me. And
there's no pictures of that on the parade.
We talked about that, right? We're so proud. And it's like, wow, I didn't realize that we were like second-class citizens.
What do you mean we don't get to vote? Well, wait a minute. What do you mean our vote is different? Yeah.
Absolutely. And still, all these little check boxes don't even apply to us. There's like a Hispanic, non-Hispanic situation. But then like, you can be Puerto Rican and maybe consider yourself to be a different skin color other than white and black. So it's just not available to us.
Well, and in so many places in Latin America, and not just Latin America, a lot of countries have very different ideas of race that make our very rigid categorizations very difficult for people in terms of negotiating their identity when they're here in the States. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it that, you know, I have to say, and I'm going to piss some people off, and that's just what it is, you know, blackness, right? We live in a country that still operates by the one drop rule. We have, most of us, way more than one drop of black blood. And yet we're not taught about that piece of our history. And so we don't know how to acknowledge it. I just wrote something the other day where I said, I will not deny my African ancestry. That is a form of white supremacy. And I will not do it, and pissed a whole bunch of other people off, right? But, you know, that's sort of the way that we're taught to look at this. So there's so many complexities just around race and racialization. And then you add to that ethnicity and pan-ethnicity. And then you add to that nationality and migration and immigration patterns. And then you add to that colorism. And just all the way down the line, there are so many pieces of the way that Latinx identity is pushed onto us, and the things that we have to negotiate as we build a greater self-awareness, that we should start learning those things earlier, but we don't. So find me a city college.
And we really enjoy, and so Ray will often like joke around, like sometimes the after party, like we should be sharing those videos of the after like the conversations that happen before and after the segments are really interesting and funny and pretty dope. And so we were thinking about a topic, and we're like, okay, wait, you know, so some of us feel like Latinx is probably not something that we identify with. And then, but if we don't say Latinx, then we're kind of not being inclusive enough, particularly of younger folks. It's really interesting, right? So even just coming up with a topic.
Even the language.
On representation, overrepresentation, misrepresentation, even that we couldn't like, right? And the other thing is like, so we had Latinx or Latino. I started with the Latino. I don't particularly identify as Latinx, and I think it's my age. And
Latina.
I'm a Latina. To me, I love everyone, but that's my thing. That's my journey. Yeah. And so even like to say presente, it's almost like, is it a question or is it a fact? You know,
absolutely.
Are we really presente? And I think that's the conversation today.
Yeah, because how did we start this conversation? So the viewers, everybody who's at home, you guys pull in because this is going to be exciting. We were like, all right, so there's Cardi B and her WAP situation you were telling me about. Is that what it is? Yes. There's COVID and there's the election. And somehow those are really important spheres in the world of the Latinx community right now. And how do we bring those things together? And really at the core of it, it's about representation. Because when I think of COVID, I think about the disproportionate number of people of color and particularly Latinos who are represented in terms of the illness, right? And having been infected. And then I think about politics, and I think about the inordinate amount of people who are left out, right? The lack of representation, the underrepresentation.
Let's start there, right? So, you know, I think historically we've been left out of important conversations, particularly in politics and of course leadership. And you know, I'll let you kind of like dissect that issue and really take a deeper dive. But right now with the Republican and Democratic conventions, like we're seeing a ton of diversity for the first time, you know, and so I guess, you know, the question is, yes, we've been underrepresented, but now it looks like we're almost overrepresented. And is it genuine? You know what I'm saying?
That's it. The question is why?
Right.
Why now?
Why you think it is?
With this space. Why now? Why?
Right. So you have all this anti-immigrant sentiment, right? I mean, outright racist, you know, rhetoric around racist and divisive rhetoric from the beginning of the term, the administration. And now all of a sudden you have a bunch of Latinos, and, you know, immigrants, and he had actually, we can talk about this later, but they actually had a clip of a naturalization ceremony for citizens. But anyway, so what do you think about this? Talk about,
I think that we're being played. Here's the thing. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm politic averse, right? So I'm not going to come up here in front like I have it down, because I don't. I often will ask, who is this person on TV? And it's a person I've seen a million times, right? But I can't keep it together. And I'll tell you why. And I'm not ashamed to say this, not just because it's my experience and I'm being honest, but also because I know I represent a large segment of our population who is so disenfranchised and so disillusioned with the process that we've disengaged, for better or worse. I don't feel good about that. And I do my best to learn more and to read more and to ask more questions so that I can be informed, because I know that even though I don't have the voice I would like, I do have a voice that counts, right? And so I want to make sure that it counts when I use it. But ultimately, there is such a vacuum in terms of representation, and we all know it. And so it becomes very suspicious when all of a sudden we see people who look like us being used as props, right? And that doesn't mean that they don't have more to offer than props. I'm not suggesting that they are props. I'm suggesting that they are being utilized in that fashion to coerce us into believing that if somebody who is beside you looks like me, then there's a possibility that my interests might matter to you.
Right.
And I know that's the brainwash game. So
Right.
how do I feel about it? I feel like I'm being played every single time.
And it's
every time I watch
his campaign because of his rhetoric throughout the entire administration. I mean, it just doesn't.
And on both sides, let me tell you something. I vote Democratic. That's not a secret. But there are people on both of the aisle pissing me off all day.
Right.
I am not a huge fan of extremists on either end, and the exorbitant amount of oppression that translates from the voices of people in power, regardless of what side of the aisle they choose to stand on, is astounding and frightening to somebody like me. I can't even imagine what it does for people like what I used to be, right? When I was less educated, or when I had a little less money, or when I had a little less agency, or I couldn't make the kinds of choices that I make now, right? It would have been enough to take me out. So for me, I feel like we have truly failed as a democracy. I really do. And I think that we are still by far one of the best places to be. This is still the country that I choose. But, just because you're in a family doesn't mean that you can't work on your issues as a family, right? Like, we need a whole lot of nation counseling. Just a whole lot of nation counseling. All going to sit around the table together. Why you ask me how I feel about these things? I should talk about these things.
Look, and it's not just politics, right? So we've been, historically underrepresented, not just in politics, but in leadership positions, even in, if you think of nonprofit organizations, like, I consider myself to have pursued a career where I could help people. And, and I did that, I think, because I came from a low income community and I wanted to give back. And even in, the largest nonprofits, management does not look like you and I, whether they serve people that look like you and I. So it's not just politics. And so thinking about, underrepresentation,
all the way around.
All the way around, right? And, even the media, right? And we start to talk about that as well.
My three spheres right now, right, are the nonprofit sector, the education sector, and television. Mm-hmm. Hi. Just me. I be the only Latina in every room. Right?
Yeah.
That's real. And we're talking about we're not just talking about some sectors in society. We're talking about massively influential sectors of society. We're talking about sectors of society that decide the discourse. We're talking about sectors of society that divide the resources. We're talking about sectors of society that change who we think we are, right? We got little girls watching commercials that tell them who they are. So we're talking about sectors of society that shape everything that we believe to be true about ourselves. Education, nonprofit, television. I mean, those are major sectors. The idea that in 2020, I'm still the only Latina around some of them tables is crazy. It's absurd. And then
I think that the other thing that we have talked about here and there, and maybe this is another show, but the fact that there's a perception that there's few resources. And so if you have a table where there are maybe African American or Black faces, Black folks, and the one Latina, that's okay, that's acceptable because you still have a minority at that table.
Right.
And as we continue to grow, right, and I struggle with this because the idea, unfortunately, they pin us against each other, right? So it's divisive. So it's like, if we bring in more Latinos, there has to be less African Americans. Well, that's crazy. Right. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying is that Latinos are now the fastest growing population. And for example, in a place like Orlando, it's ridiculous to me that we don't get the kind of funding, that we're not represented at those tables the way that we should be.
And it's not a good look for anybody on any end because there are different types of Black. So the idea that the category of Black is a homogenous category is absurd, and that you would represent it by filling one seat with one ethnicity that qualifies under that race, is ridiculous. So I talk about this all the time. I want to be sitting next to an African American woman, and on the other side I want a Jamaican girl, and on the other side I want a Haitian girl, and yes, bring me a Dominican girl and a Cuban girl. And I know I only mentioned islands, but there are South and Southern and Central Americans that I would like to see at the table too. There is a place for all of us. Because
one box, there might be two boxes, and that's the problem.
Yeah. And I say this all the time because when we all win, we all win. Mm-hmm. We all win. Part of the issue is that they want, and they in quotes, right? Because there's no particular person. This is just the way we're structured as a society. We're structured to believe that the experience of people of color has one very rigid presentation, right? Which is how we started talking about.
Right.
Right. Which is how we started talking about misrepresentation, because misrepresentation is about the lack of representation. It's about this idea that because there's such a scarcity of representation, we end up with one or two people out there who are charged with being the ambassadors of the whole freaking pan-ethnicity. And it's not their fault. They should be able to do whatever they want to do. But when I look over there and I see a Latina that's not representing me the way that I feel I want to be represented, it's not her fault. Right. The fact that she's the only one up there is the problem.
Right. Right. And it creates a lot of controversy in our communities because we want to support these artists. We want to support someone like a Cardi B who's honest, who's real, as real as it gets. Right? Like no censorship. She is who she is. She's from the Bronx. She was a stripper. She represents for a lot of young people a lot of freedom. And we can talk about this later when we talk about misrepresentation. But some may argue that that is not a misrepresentation, right?
Right.
So different. We're not a monolith. And that's what happens. So exactly the conversation that you and I would have about WAP and Cardi B or Eva Longoria, or, whether they represent us or not, it's the same conversation that happens in politics, right? So we have a huge divide in Central Florida, between folks, like, for example, newly arrived Venezuelans who see Trump and Marco Rubio and Republicans as being, more aggressive in their policies, or at least what they say that they would implement, right? Because they haven't really done anything, right? But in their rhetoric and in what they, what their platforms have been is that they want to help Venezuelans, and, okay, fine. And so then you have Puerto Ricans that are kind of somewhere in the middle, right? We're up for grabs. That vote is up for grabs, right?
Depending on our experience. Exactly.
Right. A lot of folks are coming and they're disillusioned with corrupt systems in Puerto Rico, lack of adequate response from the government, the federal government after Hurricane Maria. So we have so many different
paper towels.
That it's the paper towel situation. That was crazy.
Right.
So we're so different and we have such different experiences that it's really hard for us to come together on some issues. And so it's not any different.
Right. Well, I say this all the time. Listen, I am very proud to be a Latina, but that whole category is made up. You put a whole bunch of people that were colonized by the same freaking country together in one category. Nobody's talking about let's unite the Welsh and the Jamaicans because they all at some point served England, right? They put all of these very different, very diverse experiences under one category. And again, the same thing that they do with the Black category is as soon as we see that there's diversity, we need to somehow represent it with some very rigid model of what that one category needs, wants, and desires, and then we move on. And that's not the way it is. We are a huge, huge population of people with very diverse experiences and ideas.
Absolutely.
Very diverse experiences and ideas.
So even talking about representation, right? Like who's getting represented where, and that's the other thing, right? So like a newly arrived population that doesn't have the numbers is not going to see itself anywhere. And so it kind of forces, various groups to come together and it helps in terms of like, there are some pioneers and people that really set the pathway for others, right? So like, right. We feel like as Puerto Ricans sometimes, depending on what city we're talking about, that we, have paved the way for other immigrants. That's for debate. For immigrants, right. We are considered migrants. And that's debatable. We
are a colony.
And that's debatable. And actually our host and founder of Bomba Live and Found in Translation, Ray Collazo, is going to actually join us to talk about misrepresentation. Mm-hmm. And he'll be introducing some video clips, which are pretty hilarious, but also food for thought. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like what you think makes sense and represents you doesn't necessarily represent me.
Because there has to be layers of representation. And I think that's what people have to be really conscious of. And particularly, we just had someone comment who works in the media and talks about this all the time in terms of the representation of Latinos. What we have to be conscious of is that there are layers of representation. There's a physical presence that needs to be represented. That's the truth. We want to see our phenotypes. We want to see our hair types. We want to see our body types. We want to see that level of representation because aesthetics matter. Right? Visuals matter. That's why television is so freaking popular because visuals matter. Right?
So it just reminded me. So right here in Orlando, the community members are fighting to change the name of a school named after a Confederate soldier. Right? Stonewall Jackson. It's a middle school in a very Puerto Rican neighborhood. Actually Puerto Rican, Mexican, and Venezuelan, but mostly Puerto Rican, hands down, and historically Cuban. On the east side of Orlando, East Cimarron. And there's this huge, push to change the name because of what obviously, this Confederate believed in, and those are not the values that we want to, stand for. And this is time, and there was a push for this over years, but it wasn't until recently that folks, I think, really understood why it mattered, right? And I think because of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
And so pushing for not just change of the school name, but also for it to be an icon in the Latino community, right? We have now Roberto Clemente as an option, and we had Simón Bolívar as an option, and there were others. But it really speaks to when a child is going to a school that's named after a Confederate soldier, okay, it's not giving them obviously historical lesson. It's not representing them. It doesn't represent. It should not exist to begin with. But it's certainly not representative of that child's experience and doesn't empower them to believe that they can achieve what they are able to achieve, right? And so I feel like
it's not a symbol of hope for them.
It's not a symbol of hope, and
it's not a symbol of a safe place.
This is the South. But we've actually, as folks that are pushing for this, we've actually had to really explain that to folks, even to adults and educated people like you and I, and people that are Latino, that are Puerto Rican, because I don't think they understand it. And it's because of this history of oppression, right, of who we are. And so to be proud of who we are and have a name of Roberto Clemente somehow put somebody else down. So the response is always...
It's always a competition for resources.
There's other minorities. There's other people in the community. I get that, right? But it's predominantly Puerto Rican or it's predominantly Latino, right? And so...
Listen, name the school whatever you want. Change the curriculum.
They need to see themselves. They need to see their history, right? And feel proud of their school, that it's not named after a Confederate soldier. I mean, it's just crazy to me.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would change the name. But here's the larger issue for me is the curriculum, right? We're going to change the name of that school, and we're still going to teach the same curriculum.
Well, yeah.
That pushed that Confederate soldier to power. We have not changed what we teach our children. My niece legit came home and told me that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And by the way, since I do homework with her when I'm in New York, when I wrote notes all in the margin for the teacher, like, please read The Miseducation of the Negro, right? She went terrified to school and erased it all. Love her. This is not a criticism of her. Erased it all because she was petrified of challenging the authority of the teacher. right? Which, by the way, speaks to the point I'm making right now, that we are not free to learn our own history. We are still enslaved to a certain degree. I'm not comparing it to the slavery of old, right? But we are still enslaved to a certain degree by the discourse that we continue to reiterate and to replicate.
It's back to what we started with, the conversation, right? That we don't learn about race, gender. We don't learn about ethnicity, our place in society, class. We don't learn about those issues unless we go to college and decide to take an elective, right? And that's assuming that you get to college, that you actually, in higher education. Otherwise, you never get it. And we've been talking about this should be available to middle school kids.
Yeah, because what are the chances you're going to get to college if through the first 12 years of your education, you've never seen yourself?
Absolutely.
Right? Which brings us back to the layers of representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Because under that layer of representation of aesthetics, we need substance, right? That's the other thing. That's why I said, please stop putting girls that look like me next to you on these freaking political stages. No shade against them, but where they been, right? Like, I'm good. I'm all the way good on it. You know why? Because at the end of the day, underneath the aesthetic representation, which is important, I'm not devaluing, I'm not diminishing, and I'm not dismissing it. Underneath that aesthetic representation, I need substance. I need not just to see myself or see people that look like me, but I need to hear people who have the same concerns in life that I have. I need the people that you... Yeah, even if I don't agree with, let me tell you, I look up to a whole bunch of people I don't agree with. We don't have to share the same interests. We don't have to share the same opinions. But I need to be clear that in your opinion, there's a consideration for the experiences of others. Right? Otherwise, what you're doing up there, just please stop. Just stop. Please stop.
Well, I want to remind folks to subscribe to Bomba Live on YouTube and Found in Translation. You can find these anywhere you can download a podcast. We're going to be talking about overrepresentation. But first, we'd like to show you a classic moment from the inaugural Bomba Live, where Afro-Latina activist Rosa Clemente, speaking of Clementes, chopped it up.
Yeah. And speaking of Afro-Latinidad, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm excited about this. She chops it up with a few freestyle music legends. So, Ray, we're ready for
that. Freestyle was everything to me. My cousin Guido, who still lives in the Bronx, was the first one to introduce me and sneak me into the Copacabana. So it's kind of
kidding.
So yeah, I mean,
is that queso?
So Rosa,
it was the 80s.
Tell us about the Copa in the 80s.
No, actually, all I remember was dancing and always getting in trouble for breaking curfew. It's just what it is.
I can't explain what I'm going through. Wish I could find the right words to say. Losing control and it's over you. Nobody else can make me feel this way. Could it just be that I'm curious and I wanna make you play my game? But something tells me that it's serious, because I go insane when I hear your name. I'm hooked on you, yeah. Whoa, 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 whoa. I'm hooked on you, yeah. What can I do? It's over you.
Yes.
freestyle.
We just do
baby.
that. I'm hooked on you.
Sing too, girl. Whip.
No, I can't sing. No. That's just these Logitechs are unbelievable. That was an ad for Logitech right there.
It sounded good to me. I love freestyle. It brings me back, man.
I know, me too. Me too.
Taking the train.
Yeah. This is a perfect example of what we were talking about. It's a great segue because I remember growing up listening to freestyle and hip hop, right? I was like, those were my musics, right? And I remember having a conversation with somebody and saying like, oh, you need to listen to freestyle? And they were like, oh no, girl, I used to listen to hip hop. as if they were mutually exclusive. And which is what we do, which is what we talked about, that somehow when you're for us, particularly Puerto Rican women in the Bronx, we didn't have the luxury of just having one interest, one taste, one thing, right? Like we had to be well-versed in multiple worlds. And that level of diversity is not just a part of our experience in terms of living in this world, but it's a part of our ancestry and what we're made up of. We're made up of so many things that you can put on almost anything and catch my attention. Might be my mistake.
And I love that.
Ancestral derivatives of my ADHD.
Oh, you are
okay. Almost anything, and I'm like, yes, I got you. Huh?
Don't be blaming it on the Bronx, okay?
But that's a really important piece of it.
Though I absolutely love my experience growing up in the Bronx in a very mixed community. Like I grew up in a community. Like if you look at my class photo, the corny class photos where everybody's just standing there or sitting there, depending on what your position was. It was very much Latino and Black, like straight up. And I love
African American.
I'm sorry.
Latino and African American. It was very much Black.
Okay. It's another conversation, right? Like I don't get to decide what people identify as or what's appropriate for the time, but I feel pretty comfortable that people that are African American have embraced Blackness and say Black the same way in Puerto Rico. We have this issue with calling people negra. It's really interesting. And actually, we were on a show with some of the folks from Collective Ile. I'm saying Colectivo Ile. And this in Puerto Rico, they're starting to embrace that word, negra.
The appropriation of oppressive terminology.
Instead of saying, I'm negrita, right? Because negrita minimizes the Blackness, right? To be a little more acceptable, right? So
right.
It can be out of love. And that's a very different way of identifying, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I say, but let's talk about that. Why you said African American though?
Well, the only reason that I said it that way is because my experience has been that people will say things like Black and Latino as if you are not, as if you would be one or the other, right? Or they will be, my classmates were Black and Puerto Rican. No, your classmates were Black. Some of them were Puerto Rican.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying? Like
Ricans, and some of them were lighter skinned Puerto Ricans because they don't have a box. I would, if I was a little darker, I think I'd be more like comfortable saying I'm Black, but I feel like I'm more brown or more.
I feel like you and I have the same complexion, and I'm Black. My DNA came back all the way 33% African.
Check the stupid DNA. People that have done it, they find that they have traces in all these places of the world, and I'm like, yeah, but that's not how I identify. So I really don't care to know what my DNA is.
I mean, listen, I think it's a very, very, very personal choice how you're going to identify in the world. And I think it's important for people to have the choice because largely racial and ethnic classifications in this country have been about how you're perceived and not how you self-identify, right? How you self-identify has not really mattered forever. Right? So I do believe that people do have the choice and the right to say, this is how I would like to identify. But I think as a Latino community, we have to also be conscious of how we're perceived, right? And I think that sometimes, I don't feel this way about you, but I want to be clear that I do feel this way about a lot of people. Right. Sometimes we draw that distinction because we are very clear that in the United States, the Black experience has been associated with inferiority. And so us not joining that is a way of fitting, putting ourselves into a different, a superior category, which just perpetuates the bullcrap. Yeah, so
my decision not to identify as a Black woman is actually out of respect to Black women who are darker and have different texture hair. And I could be wrong, but that's how I feel.
I don't think it's wrong. I think this is the conversation.
And they are subject to being discriminated against more so than I would be, right? Depending on the place and the space and the context.
And that's the consciousness. Like, I am very clear that I benefit from a privilege because of my complexion.
Right.
I'm very clear. And even though it works against me in some settings, it works for me in others. I am super clear about that.
Exactly.
That consciousness around my privilege doesn't change my identification. It just makes me very aware that when I identify how I am categorized, I also need to understand that in that category are people with diverse experiences who maybe don't benefit from the same privileges that I do, you know? But I think it is a conversation, and, you know, we can't be bullied into how we identify. People have to come to that.
I'm very like, you know, comfortable in my own skin, and I'm comfortable having these conversations because it's really no right or wrong. It is a very personal choice, right? So like you and I are having a conversation, we're basically disagreeing on something, but that's the idea that we need to process these things because there's no right or wrong around it, right? Like you have always said, I'm Black, you know, and I have always thought about that. And so that's very interesting that she feels comfortable saying that, because to me, you know, I've been very conscious of that, you know, to make sure that I don't offend anyone by claiming Blackness that other people don't think I have. Entiende? Right. It's very interesting. And actually we had something at UCF on Blackness in the Latino community, and the speaker asked people, you know, to raise their hand if they're Black, and I did not raise my hand, and we had this whole conversation about it. She's like, why? And I was like, it's not that I reject Blackness, it's that I want to make sure that I don't offend anyone by claiming Blackness. That we can leave that there. You know what I'm saying, right?
I'm more used to offending people. I don't have the same sensitivities.
Right.
No, listen, I understand, particularly in the United States, the continental United States, the Black experience, and I said the and not the because I'm using the quotes right around the Black experience in the United States has been categorized largely by the African American experience in the United States, right? When people think about Blackness, they think about the African American experience, and that's okay. It is a story that needs to be told. It is a story that for a very long time was either not told or mistold, and it continues to be mistold. And so that should continue. There should continue to be a space where it is elevated and honored, right? So I'm not suggesting that including other people be done to replace that. Right. I just think that this is how we get ourselves in trouble, because when we end up categorizing a very diverse racial group on the basis of one particular ethnicity that had an experience, then we don't actually end up bringing back in any of the other experiences. And that's how people end up checking boxes and thinking they did a good job, right? On both sides of the aisle.
And so Antonio Torres had a comment earlier on, and I probably missed some other ones, but he said his friend asked him if freestyle was R&B for Spanish people, which I think is hilarious. So kind of. But let me say, Love Mary, I grew up, you know, Jodeci, like there was, that's just the fabric of like who I am and how I grew up, and I miss it because music has changed, and you know, things are different, and I'm in the South now, and it's just different, and music has changed.
We're old.
But the idea that people are Spanish people, right, brings me back to this idea. Like we kind of go back and forth between you, myself, and Judy, Dr. Perez, who's not on the phone today. I mean, on the podcast today, between Latino, Latina, Hispanic, Latinx. I feel like there's a generation that identifies as Hispanic. I feel like there's a younger generation that identifies as Latino or Latina. And then, of course, if we want to be more inclusive, gender inclusive, then there's like Latinx.
Zoe, what's your favorite Jodeci track? Is the comment that's on there now.
Forever My Lady.
How about, okay, ready? Come and talk to me. I really want to meet you, girl. I really want to know your name. Okay, stop.
Second time you sing. Like, I feel like you have a thing that you haven't told me about. Like, you like
No, listen, I hear everything that you're saying about the identification labels, and it is, we get caught in semantics often, and largely because we are trying to describe something that's in many ways indescribable, and so we're never going to land, right? We talk about, for a very long time in my upbringing, I was a Spanish girl. I was a Spanish girl in the crew.
Really?
Right? And guys that I dated were known as guys that dated Spanish girls, right? Right? That's just what it was. For a very long time, that's how we were described. And then at some point, probably in college, I realized that I am being identified by my colonizer. That because I speak the language of my colonizer, that somehow that identity has been transposed onto me. And I had to sit and think about how I feel about the fact that the language that I'm being identified with is the language of my colonizers. That's real. We have to talk, like at some point we have to have that conversation, right?
And I only have water in here, and people swear that I have like other things in here. I swear it's water. It's not, there's not enough alcohol content to talk about that deepness, right? It's the language of the colonizer and how we've like internalized it and accepted it. And people argue about this all the time. And so I don't get offended if someone says, oh, you're Spanish. Like if there's a teachable movement, like we can talk about it. Be like, actually, you know, I prefer Latina. But honestly, it doesn't bother me because I don't care. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to be perceived as whatever that person wants to perceive me as. So it doesn't matter if I correct people. And I think that that's one difference between, I guess, my generation, maybe it's because I'm from the Bronx. I don't know what it is. And like some of the younger folks that I know that sometimes get really caught up in these titles and these categories.
I think it's personal for different people. Like I'm from the Bronx too, raised mostly in Yonkers and then back to the Bronx, and you know my story. But the reality of the situation is I'm like you. I don't get easily offended. I'm not sensitive about it. You call me anything and it is what it is. But here's what I will say. You and I have very strong personalities. And there's a very good chance that if you're in a conversation with us, you can call us anything and it's not going to offend us because you'll know our heart, right? We're in a conversation where we feel the power of our interaction will speak for us beyond the label that might be placed on us. And if I have the opportunity to be in an interaction with another person where I believe the power of our interaction will speak for me beyond the label you put on me, I'm less sensitive to that. But if we're talking
in this country than to worry about these damn labels. At least
but here's the thing. But if we're talking about massive amounts of people being labeled by other people who do not have the opportunity to have the interaction that would be more powerful than the label, now we're in a different conversation.
And I think representation.
Exactly. And I think that's why some people are sensitive to it. Not because they're sensitive in the moment, but because they understand this is a microcosm for the misunderstanding of a massive amount of people.
At the macro level. Absolutely. So just real quick, like Ray's loving the fact that you sang Jodeci, and he wants to make sure that he puts a clip on that on Bomba Life, and he will repeat it. You can see it. If you go on Facebook, he will repeat it like 5 times, girl. So get ready. Okay. And the more you sing,
please don't do that. Please don't do that.
Trust me. So
why do Puerto Ricans straight from the island get more offended about those classifications? For example, calling them Spanish. Luis Morales wants to know. You want to take that one, Zoe?
I mean, I'll take part of it. I'm not straight from the island, but I live in Orlando, which means everybody around me is. And I feel that based on your experience, the number of generations here on the, you know, obviously here versus the island. But for me, if somebody asks me where I'm from and I'm surrounded by white folks or folks that are different, they're not Latino, for example, I would say I'm Latina or Hispanic, depending on how I'm feeling that day, because I use them both interchangeably. If I'm in a room full of Latinos, I'm going to say I'm Puerto Rican. And if I'm in a room full of Puerto Ricans, I'm going to say I'm from Barceloneta.
Right.
So I think it really just things, for me, it's context. I think that when you grow up on a tiny island where identity is so strong, but also so complex because of the U.S. citizenship, people might be more sensitive around the label. But
I think for me, I'm not from the island either, but I grew up with a lot of people who were all from the islands, right? I'm a 1.5er. So for me, I really think that
term 1.5, yeah.
Yeah, or actually I think that's, well, I don't know. I'm a second generation. My mom's a 1.5er. Anyway, the point of the story is my mom came to the States when she was about 13 from Puerto Rico, and my entire family was born on the islands except for my dad on his side. And so really, I have a lot of that experience, even though that I can't speak to it personally. But I will say this, it's very difficult for you on a small island to be called by the name of the people who conquered you, right? Like, if you were in America and you called Americans British, they would lose their shit. Oh, can I curse?
Yeah. Yes, you can. But I think that what's
Right?
interesting is that you have a ton of Puerto Ricans that say, no, porque mi mamá es
Oh,
española.
yeah,
española.
yeah. They'll take pride in it. So I think to the question that was asked, it depends on who you're asking. If people are sensitive to being called Spanish, I think in large part it is due to the conquest, right? And the devastating ramifications that it had for the people on the island. But you're right, Zoe, there's a whole segment of the population that takes pride in it because
Blanca, España.
oh yeah, no, I'm gonna say the words white supremacy again and see how many people are pissed off. Because we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about the fact that there is a historic ingredient of white supremacy in the way that Latinos have been taught about racialization. We don't want to talk about that. I don't care if you identify as black or white or whatever. If you look at our cultural perspective, there is in readings, in folk tales, in novelas, God bless the novelas, they make the argument for me, right? There is a prejudice toward Eurotypical features, complexion, hair, right? All of the things that we would aesthetically use to define a Spaniard.
Right.
And that's not a coincidence. There's people who are paid to cast that way, right? It's not like they just picked up some people in a random place. Right? This is a perpetuation of our ideology that we have been really, really indoctrinated by. We are taught to believe that the lighter we are or the lighter we can trace,
the more beautiful
somehow the better we're off we are and will be. Yeah, so if we don't...
Because of the racist society that we live in, I mean, to some extent, it's true. It's almost like you're trying to protect, your family. It's like, make sure you marry white, mejorar la raza, make sure you whiten the race. Why? Because then you'll be less susceptible to violence. I mean, look what's happening in our society today, Dios mío.
Yeah, okay, but here's the thing. What's the sacrifice? What do you lose, right? So, like, we can't keep our people safe at the risk of them knowing who they are.
Right.
And I get that. Listen, the trauma is real. Like, we talked about the laws on the island that basically would have people, immediately incarcerated and murdered if they were known to be black for any reason, right? So I could see why, for survival alone, there would have been a desire to pass. For survival alone, right? When you're in these racist times, I can see that. But now it's become a thing that we have to own. If we did it, even if we did it for that reason, if we did it, we have to own it and undo it, because we cannot keep our children safe from racism by teaching them that they are not racialized.
Well, so let's talk about overrepresentation real quick, right? So, when we thought of the title, we're like, it's really interesting. We're underrepresented, and we tend to talk about that experience more than anything. But we don't realize that we're grossly overrepresented in other spaces, right? So could you tell us more about what you think about that?
Well, I think the thing that hit me the hardest, and I think most people, I've said this in other platforms, most people know that I lost my dad during the time of COVID. And I think what hit me the hardest is the stats around the amount of people of color who were infected and for whom it was fatal. And when we look at the research, there's and when we look at the research, there's good reasons for that, right? For why it was fatal. And it's because there are larger numbers of people of color in communities of color, particularly in Latino communities, who suffer from a lot of the illnesses that made you at a higher risk for COVID being
lack of insurance.
Exactly. Right. So that's a particular other thing. So there's lack of resources, which we're going to talk about, adequate health care, as you were talking about health plans, right? Because there's adequate health care, and then there's how you're paying for that, right? So there's that. And then let's also talk about overcrowding cities and waiting rooms, right? And, population density. So there's all of that. But then there's also, not necessarily detached from that, but at least a separate conversation, the fact that we're overrepresented in a lot of illnesses, asthma, COPD, high blood pressure, hypertension. I mean, in a lot of those illnesses, you see people of color and Latinos as a subsection of those people of color. In particular, we are overrepresented in terms of who is living and dying from and with those illnesses. So we're not having conversations about our wellness. We're not having conversations about self-care, which, you know, I can't say it enough, that's why it's my specialization, right? Because we're, you know, everything else is trying to take us out, right? You know, so we're not having these conversations about wellness. We're not having these conversations about self-care. We're not having conversations about healthy living because nobody has time for it. Nobody thinks it's important. Nobody is making it a priority. Culturally, we haven't been taught that that's important.
And we were just talking about, being more susceptible because of skin color to violence. I mean, we're overrepresented when it comes to, police brutality, right? Mm-hmm. We're represented, the issue of mass incarceration of people of color, right? Historically, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
So there's so many different ways that we're overrepresented. And I know that, Ray, I think, wants to he's actually going to be joining us to talk about misrepresentation. But if you can just talk a little bit more about, we were starting to have a conversation about like hypersexualized roles, right? Like, so if you think of, what's the woman, it's not Eva Longoria, it's the other one, the Latina that comes on. There's this really cool show and I forget the name of it.
Modern Family.
Modern Family. I love that show. Sofia Vergara. I think she's awesome. I think she's beautiful. She's gorgeous. She's talented. Yeah. She's been doing this for a long time. She deserves everything she has.
Absolutely.
But, it really annoys me that she has that strong accent on that show. And I can't tell you, I have never had a conversation with her and I really haven't seen her interviews. But I feel like she actually like, what did you call it?
She forcefully mispronounces
more, right? The pronunciation on the show. And it bothers me. It really bothers me. And so, but anyway, for me, that's like, it's like in some cases misrepresentation, but look, people have accents, right? Mom has an accent, right? And some people do.
Mine too.
I'm sorry?
Mine too.
Yeah.
My mom has an accent too. But listen, I'm not against accents. I'm against the only Latina on TV having the accent, right? And again, this brings us back to the fact that a huge portion of our misrepresentation can be credited to our lack of representation, right? Our misrepresentation and our underrepresentation are correlated strongly, right? Because so I don't have it. Listen, I think Sofia Vergara is bad, and since I can curse, I'll say she's bad as fuck. I have zero issue with her. But you brought up Eva Longoria. Now you have Sofia Vergara, the women, Latina women who are pigmented to be a little lighter, right? Who have the straight hair, who are very thin, and who are housewives.
And when you think about it, it also comes down to substance. So like for me, I am more inclined to want to see a Eva Longoria because she's more involved in politics. She's more involved in, advocating for immigrants, for the last 5-10 years. So yes, she played the role of a housewife and that's what got her where she is. And now she's an influencer. But I don't see myself or my experience in Sofia Vergara's like roles, but also like, in her personal life, she doesn't seem to do as much as
to mirror that. Right. Well, I mean, but here's the thing. I don't see listen, I don't like to cook and I don't like to clean. And everybody knows that about me. So I don't see myself in none of those experiences. But I respect that they have to take what roles are there. But that's a misrepresentation and that's an underrepresentation. I'm sure that first of all, those women are uber talented. They're uber talented and they've been doing this for a very long time. I'm sure that there is a diversity of roles they wish they were presented that they're not, right? because it's the same thing that we see with African American women or darker skinned women. I'm going to say not even African American women, but we see this like dark skinned women have one role, right? Mm-hmm. Brown skin or middle skin or whatever we want to call them, women have another role, and then white women have another role. And we're incredibly rigid in the way that we represent. Now, because more white women are represented in media, there is a larger diversity of what that representation looks like. But even they are not coming close to the diversity of experiences. I remember the first time I saw Roseanne, and I was shocked at the representation of a white woman in poverty on television. Shocked, blown away. Why was I shocked by that? That's crazy. Why was that? I was watching Que Pasa USA. I didn't feel no kind of way about their 80,000 jobs and the fact that they were clearly poor, right? But when I saw Roseanne, I was like, and I was young, but I knew there was a difference.
Yeah,
right?
It didn't shock me. I think it provided perspective, like white folks can be poor too, you know. So I wasn't shocked because I didn't have.
But the fact that we didn't know, right? Like the fact that we would be like, "Oh, this provides perspective," is crazy.
And she was interesting because she was just like she was, I guess, a decent mom, but she was also like, whatever, just don't kill each other, you know, that kind of to see that.
Right. In the world of the Cosbys, where you had a doctor married to a lawyer who were raising their children by the book and yada, yada, yada. Right.
Unfortunately, the Cosby was, but anyway.
Well, you know, we're talking about the script.
I know we're kind of behind on our clips, so I want to make sure that we get to it. So real quick, we're actually going to show a clip for next week's, it's related to next week's Back to School y la Escuela Pa' Cuando special edition, which will be co-hosted by Ray and educator Shirley Santos, along with Adriana Montalvo, Marisol Serrano Colón, and Puerto Rican YouTube sensations Kaidel and Axel. So they're actually going to show us these hilarious clips from Los Niños.
Vamos a empezar de nuevo. ¿Cuánto es 2 más 2?
No sé.
¿Cómo se llama esto?
Eso es un 4.
Así que 2 más 2 es igual a... Vamos a tratar de esta manera. Aquí hay 2 galletas. Y en el plato hay 2 galletas. Si muevo estas 2 galletas al plato, ¿cuántas galletas hay en el plato? Axel.
Galletas.
Axel, ¿cuántas galletas hay en el plato?
¿Qué tiene un avión? Kael, ahí está llegando un avión.
Pues vamos. Hola, bienvenido a Puerto Rico.
Welcome to Puerto Rico.
¡Todo Puerto Rico! A comer pastel, a comer lechón, arroz con cangura y a beber ron. Que venga bolsilla, venga de todo. Y que se chave con...
Turista, bienvenido a Puerto Rico. Tenemos las mejores playas, tenemos buena música y también tenemos buena comida.
Y también tenemos coronavirus.
Come on now. That one kind of hit the heart, that last little piece.
Yeah.
Oh, you feeling a certain way about Cariel y Axel? Come on. They're a special guest. They're going to be doing it past their bedtime next week. So.
A comer pastel, a comer lechón, arroz con
I love it. They were amazing. They're so cute. Oh my God.
They're adorable. Great. They're going to be a big part of the show next week.
Yeah,
I love it.
That's
my kind of math. You go ahead and bring me cookies. See what we come up with.
That is awesome. So thank you so much. Thanks so much for letting me squeeze in these Mujeres Edition shows. It's tough to get a ticket, I hear. So, and I want to give you ladies a shout out. You're very relatable because, you know, we part of the reason we wanted to dedicate some episodes to people like you both and some of the other strong women that are part of the Bomba Life Found in Translation family was to give love to the ladies. And the guys are the ones giving all the comments. Antonio Torres, Luis Morales. I want to shout out D Marzin on Instagram. They gave you some shout outs on this important conversation. So I've been enjoying it in the background like everybody else.
Yay.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We love having a male perspective, and we're grateful that you allowed us to crash your space.
Well,
your Man Cave podcast.
There you go. So, not like there's any sports to talk about. So, but that's a whole other conversation. So what I wanted to do is actually channel some of the people that are watching, because there's a lot of questions related to race, representation, and, this is in the backdrop of it being the last night of the Republican National Convention and all of this political turmoil that we have in our country. And so somebody that, unless you're a real political geek, like I am, you probably didn't know really much about this person. And very few people knew she's Puerto Rican. I'm talking about, of course, the internet sensation of the Republican National Convention, Kimberley Guilfoyle, who made a very provocative speech at the RNC and made a lot of noise and a lot of conversation just about her style, but also kind of how she represents the Puerto Rican Latino community. So we want to play a couple clips of her presentation and get our experts' thoughts about how this may misrepresent our community. So this is very something that's been the talk of the week, and we want to get y'all take on it. So let's get the clip on here, and we're going to hear the first clip, and then get Zoe and Dr. D's thoughts on Kimberley.
When you are in trouble and need police, don't count on the Democrats. As a first-generation American, I know how dangerous their socialist agenda is. My mother, Mercedes, was a special education teacher from Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. My father, also an immigrant, came to this nation in pursuit of the American dream.
Now, that got a lot of Puerto Ricans' attention, my friends, because last time I checked, Puerto Ricans aren't immigrants. So talk to us, ladies.
So Puerto Rico is a colony, but it is also known as a commonwealth. And when we move from the colony, commonwealth, island, to the States, we do so freely, do not need a passport, do not need to be naturalized, and we are not, therefore, immigrating. We are migrating. Also, I don't understand why this has to be the experience of all Latinos. I don't understand it.
I don't think she even knew her mom. Like, she didn't pronounce her mom's name the right way. I think she struggled with Mercedes. So she definitely doesn't represent me for a lot of reasons. I think it's interesting because I also identify as I'm sorry, not myself. I'm not from the island. I also use migrant to describe folks that migrate from Puerto Rico to the U.S. on the state side, because we have citizenship. We are U.S. citizens. Pero I saw some interesting comments from fellow Boricuas, okay? And let me tell you, Puerto Ricans from the island are divided in terms of their politics. And then we have Puerto Ricans in the diaspora who are divided with our politics. And then when we come together, it's really interesting, right? But anyway, there were some people that said, but we are treated as immigrants. We're treated as foreigners. We are treated as, second-class citizens. And I agree with that experience. I get it. So it's really interesting. If you're talking about an island, so, it's not contiguous, it's not connected to the mainland. There's a different experience. We have a different predominant language. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Like,
no, listen, for sure. We are otherized here. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And to the extent that is an experience that immigrants share, that is not a far reach. It was a misspeak, but it's not a far reach, right? I don't want to pick her apart on, just a term here or there. I think here's the thing with her, and it's the same thing.
The dog is enough. Yeah.
Well, but the other thing is, and this is what I don't like. This is why I feel I'm a whole grown woman. Don't come at me talking about, and if you vote for Democrats, you're voting against cops. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. Because the issue is, and I'm very clear on what you're doing. What you're doing is manipulating me. What you're doing is trying to use my fear as a person in this country that will at some point experience the need to be protected, right? Because we all have. And large numbers of people of color are in urban environments where you feel more vulnerable to crime because crime rates are often higher. And so now you're using a fear that I'm probably familiar with to try to sway me to your side by demonizing the other side. Don't do that.
Trying to get us, all Puerto Ricans, to forget when you threw paper towels at us after Hurricane Maria. One of the worst disasters to hit.
Paper towel trauma is real.
And that's been if I could jump in, that's been sort of a theme of the RNC this week, is that, you know, they did this citizenship ceremony, which, by the way, they caught people by surprise. They didn't tell them how. First of all, that's just rude and put people in a terrible position. They've
That's
rolled
the
out
reality show presidency, though.
exactly, and it's very much a
Bring
game
your
show.
cameras.
So they bring the one black guy, you know, the one black football player he's been friends with for a long time, and he brings the one black guy that, you know, he who seems like a good man, who has a reentry program out in Vegas. And he absolves them on national television. It's very much a game show president, and it brings that to that question, and people that need to pay close attention, because, you know, they're saying these things, but then at the same time, what has been the tracker for the last 3.5 years, which is a terrible treatment of immigrants, a terrible treatment of people on the island of Puerto Rico, and a rhetorical, as you talked about earlier, an overrepresentation, D, and very little concern seemingly from this administration around who's getting impacted by the COVID-19 crisis.
Right.
But then these game show moments on this television show are supposed to absolve that. And one of the things that you asked me, D, before the show was, well, who's this for? And quite honestly, it's for people that are already Trump supporters, but in their heart, no, wow, this is a terrible guy. He's not really doing a good job. But, you know, if he's taking care of these people, maybe he's not as racist as I think, and it'll make me feel better about doing something that I really know in my heart is wrong. Let's vote for this guy again, because a lot of these people will.
The Puerto Rican community here, especially among newly arrived people that grew up on the island, they tend to lean Republican if they're pro-life, right? And so
that's the religious influence by the colonization.
So I watched bits and pieces of the Republican convention, not all of it, because it's hard to swallow. It's straight up hard to swallow. But there's a ton of references to socialism and demonizing that, right? To communism. There's a ton of references to what we were just talking about, like pro-life and protecting children's lives. And, you know, it's fear mongering, right? Yes. And so, you know, it's not genuine. Obviously, we know that our people of color are being brought on for the show, for the spectacle. You know, it's crazy, but it's really dangerous because unfortunately, you know, in the newly arrived Puerto Rican community, you know, that really splits our community up. You know, people tend to lean Democrat or Republican, not only based on the economy, but also the pro-life, pro-choice discussion because of religion. And it's really hard.
Don't rip them from the womb. Rip them from their parents.
Right.
That's the argument.
When you come from the north, you know, it's heavily blue, you know, a lot of pro-choice, a lot of liberal folks, and then you come to a place here and you try to inform and educate the community, and religion is that stronghold. It's that strong. And I heard a ton of references to religion and God bless todo el mundo and God bless America over and over and over again. And it's this
which is fine. Listen, it's fine. Right. It's just a manipulation.
It is. But you and I can't be manipulated. But guess what? The people that are, you know what I'm saying?
I think I am not an expert by far, and I am not an ambassador of Latinidad. I do not represent the views of my very diverse people, right? That is not my role. But if we do anything on this podcast today, it is to help people identify when they're being manipulated. We should have called the show "You're Being Played," right? Because this is not about whether or not you agree with what they're saying. Listen, if we get into a fight and you offer me chocolate, I'm going to take the chocolate. I don't have no problem with chocolate. That don't make the chocolate bad. But you are manipulating me by offering me the chocolate when we just had a conflict. You're dangling something in my face that you believe I will identify with to help me to forget that we are at odds. So I don't care if you like chocolate. That's fine. But realize that when you're being offered the chocolate, it is a manipulation. Now eat the chocolate if you want to, but remember you got played.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to Zoe's reference for a second around how, going back to really what's going to be a big part of this conversation next few months, was just mobilizing the Puerto Rican Latino vote in Florida and around the country, right? So you're absolutely right, Zoe. So, and there's been a lot of conversations about this around New Yorkers go to Florida, try to tell these Florida Puerto Ricans how to organize and strategies, progressive people or Democrats, and not having these conversations. So in 2008, dated myself, I had a organizer in Central Florida, super progressive guy, he was more progressive than me. Okay. So one day I walk in and we're about to start the canvassing. Now this is to do vote, turn out the vote. Basically a Pentecostal revival was the beginning of the meeting, because most of the canvassers were evangelical, Pentecostal, and they liked starting the day by praying and doing this thing. And I said, Roberto, this is kind of a little borderline here. He goes, look, obviously, we you and I wouldn't do it this way, but this is their comfort zone. Most of these people just got here from Puerto Rico.
Right.
And, and this is a way for us to bring them. And there was really nothing wrong. It's actually very sweet. And I don't want anyone watching this thinking we're against religion or anything like that. I'm a religious person, all religious people. But because we either have a very dogmatic conversation, like we don't have the conversation. We got to understand where people are at and hopefully get them to understand that. And look, I'm not saying it's an easy issue, and I struggle with it sometimes because a lot of us, our spiritual opinion is different than our policy opinion, right? Like, so I want people to understand that, right? But at the end of the day, because we're not, and because we're not dealing with that nuance, then that's where we're falling short as Puerto Ricans, as Latino leaders, as Democrats, progressives. So it's and the reality is, look, if you're voting one issue, you really got to look at, okay, is one issue, why is this the one issue that I'm voting on? Or, it could be a slippery slope on any extreme. So I do want to play
how does that impact everyone?
Exactly. And you have to look at totality, right? So you talk about, and again, it's a very sensitive issue. It's very divisive, but you talk about however you feel about pro-life, pro-choice, right? Look at all the other stuff. So as a society, forgetting before Trump, as a society, and people talk about socialism and Medicare for all and all that. Before Obamacare, whatever you think about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, before that, if you had cancer, you had leukemia, 9 times out of 10, you got bumped off your health insurance and you either died or you were bankrupt for the rest of your life. So, we have to understand with these, you have to judge people on the totality of their rhetoric and their policies. Yeah, they can put out, they've rolled out Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans on the Republican convention saying nice things, but there's still thousands of kids on the border that are locked up, children, and they'll never see their parents again. Well, so we got to be real about it.
And don't misuse the issues that we're similar on to derail me from paying attention to the places where there are large deficits you're unwilling to confront, right? That's what I think I resent. That's the piece of it that makes me angry. And that's the piece of it that makes me feel like I'm being toyed with and that I'm not respected as a voter. That I am watching you as an educated adult woman. I'm watching you take something that you think I believe in and try to use it to help me forget the ways that I've been hurt.
That's a really good point. And they've done that a lot throughout this convention. And again, look, it's one thing to be Republican. It's one thing. Trump is a whole other thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, they have a lot of the immigrants, and it's kind of, the Latina that married the white guy, and somehow she's, now she's, and it's like, well, we work hard. And it's like, who's saying in our community that we're organizing, Zoe, that we don't want people to work hard?
No.
And, nobody's saying that.
Saying. Yeah, they keep spinning. And don't use religion and don't use Christianity, because I'm having a hard time seeing Christ up there with you.
Yeah, I just think that we're, again, speaking of privilege, right? We talked about privilege earlier around skin color, y no sé qué, pigmentation, pero we're also now speaking from a position of privilege where you and I know how to, kind of, see the BS, right? We can see the bullshit, right? But the average person, that the first institution that they actually, some of them actually come with the church. Like they actually follow the congregation here. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm not just talking about the first point of contact. I'm talking about el pastor se va pa Orlando y la familia and all the families in that area of Puerto Rico.
Barrio, sí. Oh yeah, absolutely. Right? No doubt.
Follow the pastor. One, it could be a combination of things. It could be life is really hard in Puerto Rico, so we were going to move anyway. But now that the pastor's going, olvídate, right?
Yeah.
And religion, and I'm going to say this because I'm not an expert, so I'm going to put that out there. But I really feel that religion is, in a lot of different ways in Puerto Rico, used to save the family. Because the more conservative you are, the more you can actually save your family from crime and violence that's happening.
Absolutely.
My understanding is that Puerto Rico,
and by the way, there's a lot of beautiful things too.
Has one of the highest per capita murder rates in the world. Per capita, right? So people really like hold on to their families and you use religion, right? So I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it's a way to save your family when there's so much crime and drugs in the community. It transfers here. And when you listen to these folks and they talk about God, right? Where the Democratic Party might be talking about, opportunity for women, higher pay. They're not talking about what folks that just came from.
It's not what resonates.
It's not resonating.
Yeah, well, no, the Democratic Party hasn't historically done a good job at galvanizing the troops. That's not in our repertoire. That's why I said on both sides of the aisle, we need to do better. We really do need to, I had a very, I get into what would count as political debates in my world, which I don't know a lot about, with my brother-in-law all the time, who's a big political person. He really just loves it and lives for it. And he said to me one day, I was like, well, I'm not going to vote for Trump. And he was like, so the other side just gets your vote? They don't have to earn it now? And I was like, huh. Right? Like, I had a moment.
A lot of people are feeling that way.
Right? I had him, and of course, yeah. And that's the popular sentiment right now, which is why I was saying earlier that I know I represent an inordinate amount of people that are disillusioned with what politics have become on both ends. Because you really do have to represent us better. That's why we're talking about representation. We are overrepresented in the ills of life because we've been locked out of representation in terms of leadership. And that lack of representation is what has led to the misrepresentation of our people.
A comment related to that from Ignacio Esteban, who's a colleague here. He's in Orlando, Puerto Rican. And he's talking about memory, and will we forget how Trump responded to Hurricane Maria? But it goes back, I think it's really deep. It's like we have been conditioned to expect less. We're colonized people. So we will forget, or we never had expectations around how we would be treated because of our history.
Yeah.
And by the way, you could argue that impacts the Puerto Rican leadership we have on the island.
Yeah.
Because if the expectation is we're going to be half-ass, then we'll act half-ass. And, we'll it's that, that crab mentality or whatever. Like we'll do these little corruption things and make a few extra money. Because, we're not doing that well, and that's the only way to get ahead. And
no one's
that
looking.
mentality.
Or if you don't hear me, then you won't see me, right? And that's everybody who works with children knows this to be true. If there is a child that feels unheard, they will act out. Because if you don't hear them, you won't see them, right? Sure. So if we're really negating a voice, then we have to be real careful when we start criticizing people for acting out because we robbed them of that voice.
And I was very excited when the protests happened in Puerto Rico, like as a member of the diaspora, and again, some people may disagree because I'm not from the island and maybe I'm, passing judgment. But I was like, coño, finally, yes, we should be protesting and people should be tired of this shit.
Right.
I was so happy, and there were times when I actually teared up because I was so happy. I was scared because I didn't want people to get hurt. But I still get chills just talking about it because for the first time, as someone who cares so deeply about issues that impact the Puerto Ricans, both here and on the island, I felt like it wasn't just a diaspora fighting anymore.
Right.
And that's not fair to say. Because we're not the only ones that fight, But it felt like the first time el pueblo se levantó. You know what I mean?
Right.
And we need that. We need that here.
Well, it was the first time we saw it.
the first time we saw, you're absolutely right. And that's why I want to, be mindful of the expectations
But
of my
that right there is a point.
Bipartisan, which was powerful. And the youth and the intersectionality. There's no Ricky Renuncia movement without the LGBT movement, which has fomented on the island for many years. The women's movement against the femicide. The Afro Puerto Rican movement. I mean, those movements had been fomenting through this economic crisis. So I just want to thank Zoe Colon and Dr. D. Doctor, any final thoughts? And then Zoe and I will preview what's going on here in the next few months on Bomba Live Found in Translation.
This has been amazing, and I think that, it should be said that we are three people who are only representing our individual views, but for each one of us, there are millions of people out there who have lived similar experiences and as a result feel similar ways. And so we hope that this has empowered you all to use your voice, and the time is coming for you to really make that count. So if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, if you ride, if you don't, either way, make sure that people know what's in your heart and on your mind.
Thank you so much, Dee. We're, we look up, you've been so incredible. And I know we mentioned the O piece, but, that's just one example of the acknowledgement that you should get for all the great work you do to help folks and share your vision. We really appreciate it. And I know you're zigzag. Every time you're on the show, you're in a different time zone, different city.
I know. I'm in Atlanta today.
Different condo, luxury event, accommodations, but plush, all the A+ all the way. Yeah. Zoe, next few months, we're going to be talking obviously a lot politics. Let people know what you're looking forward to in the next few months with these discussions on the show.
Well, wanted to thank you again, Judy, Dr. Perez. We Perez Caro.
We miss you.
We miss you so much. We are looking forward to the next show. It'll be, in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month or Latinx Heritage Month, whatever you vibe with, right? And I think that when it comes to representation, there's so much more to unpack. We can speak for days about these issues. But there's a lot happening right now in that is making history, right? There's a lot more exposure to issues that affect, people of color. We're moving the needle in some ways, and it hasn't been easy, and it's going to continue to be hard. But we're here for it. Like we want to talk about these issues, whether we agree or not. I think it's important to really dissect these issues. And these are our experiences. This is not us asking for people to agree with anything, but even just talking about our experiences is lacking. We need that more. We need folks from the diaspora to come together and talk about these various perspectives. We're not a monolith. We're not one voting block. We have so many different issues. We have so many different needs, strengths, experiences, and processing these and having these conversations, I think, are really important. And so I'm really glad to be part of the show. Thank you again, Ray, for the opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thursday, September 24th, we'll be back with you. Hopefully, Dr. Perez will be back with us. Hopefully, Dr. D will be able to make it, because I know she has some stuff going on. But thank you again for your time. And I think we have a clip, or I'm not sure if we're going to have.
Yeah, I'll tee it up. But thank you again, Zoe and Dr. D. But the other quick things I wanted to mention was that I'll be on back with Shirley Santos, one of our regular contributors, who's also a school teacher and a teachers union rep. Yes. So very politically active. She's got a whole slate, including those beautiful little chulitos, those adorable children that were on the show earlier. Cariel and Axel, they'll be on the show next week. So it's our back to school special. We all have anxiety. I'm still not sure if I'm sending my kids back a couple days a week, to be honest with you. I mean, there's just a lot of anxiety about this getting back into the school season for obvious reasons. But we're going to have weekly shows. We are putting out the call for it's all about the island, every Puerto Rican gubernatorial candidate of all the parties. We invite to come on here and talk to the diaspora about what you're going to do for Island. So we want to hear from everybody. And to that point, Zoe, a Puerto Rican conservative, reached out to me this afternoon and said, I enjoy the show, but I think we would want to, can I come on the show and talk about our perspective on some of this? And I said, you know what? Absolutely. We're not here to hide anything. Obviously, we have a slant and sort of a worldview, but we're willing to hear all conversations.
Sort of a slant.
Well, sort of. But the point is that, but hey, this isn't, PBS either. But at the same time, we're open to that and we're welcoming to that because we're all part of the family. This is a successful business person and a good man.
South that you got to work with both sides because you can't get much done if you alienate one or the other.
That's it.
You're not in a blue state. You're not in a blue state.
That's right, nobody is in a position to be arrogant enough to believe that they have everything covered.
Absolutely. So for new people to the show, I know Zoe and Dr. D brought a lot of new folks. Subscribe to the show at Bomba Live PR on our social media platforms. Subscribe to the podcast, the YouTube channel. And we're going to go out with a recent performance of our great friend Frankie Negron, who was on the show. And I think it's appropriate because he sung Patria for us a cappella in a recent episode. So we'll go out with our dear friend Frankie. Thank you so much, ladies, and enjoy your weekend.
Hey,
I got the blessing from Rubén Blades to do a song with him as a collab, which is amazing because the man is a freaking musical genius and a big influence. So I figured I'd sing a piece of this because I think it's pretty appropriate for the times that we're in. It was appropriate before. I think it's a little even more appropriate now. So I'll sing a little piece and it goes like this. It says, hace algún tiempo le preguntaba a un chiquillo por el significado de la palabra patria. Y como aquel viejo poema le di así: flor de barrio, hermanito, patria, son tantas cosas bellas como aquel viejo árbol. Y con el alma en la garganta le dije así: no memorices lesiones de dictaduras y encierros. La patria no la define esos que suprimen un pueblo. Ay, la patria es un sentimiento en el alma del tiempo. Patria, son tantas cosas bellas.